November 15, 2019, Atlanta. Wei Chen had choreographed death for 30 years. Car crashes, building falls, gunfights, he made destruction look beautiful. Director Marcus Kellerman didn't know that when he laughed at Wei's accent in front of 300 crew members. "Maybe get someone who speaks English to explain the stunt," Kellerman said. The laughter echoed across the soundstage. Wei set down his clipboard, removed his headset, and walked toward the exit. What happened in the next 72 hours shut down a 200 million franchise. The studio called emergency meetings. Kellerman's career ended overnight. And for the first time in Hollywood history, the industry learned what happens when you mock a man who's been recording every conversation for 3 decades. The man who never forgot his father's last words in broken English. Someone will pay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the abandoned soundstage as Wei Chen's footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. 300 faces watched him walk away from the biggest action sequence in Hollywood history. A $50 million set piece involving 6 cars, 2 helicopters, and enough pyrotechnics to level a city block. His phone buzzed. Then again. The studio executives were already panicking. Wei didn't look back. 30 years of swallowed pride had led to this moment. 30 years of being the invisible man who made stars look invincible, who turned directors' impossible visions into reality while they took credit for his artistry. Wei had built his reputation one broken bone at a time, mostly his own, perfecting stunts that had become legendary. The freeway chase in Thunder Road, the skyscraper sequence in Steel Dragon, the underwater fight scene that had redefined action cinema in Dark Current. Marcus Kellerman had directed exactly 2 action films, both financial disappointments. But he had the studio's ear and a 3-picture deal, which apparently made him untouchable. Until now. Wei pushed through the soundstage doors into the humid Atlanta night. His hands weren't shaking. They never shook. Not after 30 years of handling explosives and timing car crashes to the millisecond, but his mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the consequences of what he'd just set in motion. The parking lot stretched out before him, filled with the trucks and trailers that housed a small army of technicians, stunt performers, and equipment operators. His crew, people who'd followed him from project to project because they knew Wei Chen didn't just coordinate stunts, he protected lives. In 3 decades, he'd never lost a single performer under his supervision. The same couldn't be said for many coordinators. His phone rang. The studio head's assistant. Wei declined the call and kept walking. Behind him, through the soundstage windows, he could see the chaos beginning. Producers huddled in frantic conversation. Assistant directors barked into radios. Kellerman stood alone in the center of it all, his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that his joke had just cost Apex Entertainment more money than some countries' GDP. Wei reached his car, a modest Honda Civic that looked out of place among the luxury vehicles and equipment trucks. He'd learned long ago that invisibility was power. Let the directors drive Maseratis and the producers flaunt their wealth. Wei preferred to blend into the background, watching, listening, remembering. His phone buzzed with a text from his second-in-command. "They want to know when you're coming back." Wei typed his response, "I'm not." Another text. This one from a studio executive, "Name your price." Wei stared at the message for a long moment. If they only knew. This was never about money. This was about something worth more than any paycheck, justice delayed for 30 years. He opened his trunk and removed a small recording device, no bigger than a matchbook, one of dozens he'd planted throughout the soundstage over the past 6 months. Every conversation, every decision, every casual racist joke and dismissive comment about the Chinese guy who doesn't talk much, all of it preserved in digital clarity. The device went into a manila envelope already addressed and stamped. Tomorrow morning, copies would reach entertainment reporters, industry bloggers, and civil rights organizations. The recordings would speak for themselves, literally. But the real revelation wouldn't come from hidden microphones. It would come from the files Wei had been compiling for 3 decades. Personnel records, safety reports, accident investigations that had been quietly buried, financial documents showing how the industry protected its own while discarding the expendable. His father's death certificate topped the stack, the official cause of death listing accidental equipment failure on the set of Pacific Thunder in 1989. 20-year-old Wei had been there that day, working as a junior stunt performer, watching his legendary father prepare for what should have been a routine car chase sequence. The cables had been inspected, the car had been tested, but somehow when the moment came, nothing worked as it should. His father's Cantonese screams had echoed across the set as the car went over the bridge at the wrong angle, hitting the water hard enough to crack the reinforced glass that was supposed to break away safely. The studio had paid for the funeral. They'd offered Wei a settlement. They'd promised a full investigation that never materialized. And they'd given him a job, partly from guilt, partly to keep him close enough to watch. They had no idea they were hiring their own destruction. Wei slipped the envelope into a nearby mailbox and returned to his car. His phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The panic was spreading through the studio hierarchy like wildfire. Production schedules crumbling, release dates in jeopardy, stock prices preparing to tumble. As he drove away from the soundstage, Wei thought about his father's last words, spoken in the broken English that had embarrassed him as a child. Someone will pay. 30 years later, that debt was finally coming due. The drive home took Wei through neighborhoods he'd grown to know like his own heartbeat over the past 6 months of filming in Atlanta. Past the late-night diners where his stunt team grabbed coffee before dawn calls. Past the medical facilities where he'd personally driven injured performers when productions tried to cut corners on safety protocols. The city had welcomed the film industry with open arms and tax incentives, but Wei wondered if they understood what they'd invited in. His phone continued its relentless buzzing against the passenger seat. He'd turned off the ringer after the 20th call, but the screen kept lighting up with names he recognized, studio executives, fellow coordinators, even a few actors who'd worked with him over the years. News traveled fast in Hollywood, especially bad news. Wei pulled into the driveway of his rental house, a modest 2-bedroom in Virginia Highland that the studio's location manager had found for him. He'd specifically requested something quiet, residential, away from the hotels where the rest of the production was housed. Privacy had always been essential to his work, though the studio assumed it was just another quirk of the silent Chinese man who somehow made their impossible action sequences look effortless. Inside, the house held the temporary quality of a life lived in transit. Minimal furniture, a few personal photographs on the kitchen counter, boxes that had never been fully unpacked because Wei knew he'd be moving again once filming wrapped. He'd been living this way for 30 years, rootless, portable, ready to disappear at a moment's notice. The photographs drew his attention as they always did. His father, David Chen, accepting the Golden Horse Award for Best Action Choreography in 1987. The two of them on set together during Wei's early days as a stunt performer, Wei grinning with youthful pride while his father demonstrated a fighting sequence. The last photo, his father's memorial service, attended by hundreds of Hong Kong film industry luminaries who'd flown to Los Angeles to pay their respects. Wei picked up that final photograph, studying the faces of directors and producers who'd worked with his father. Some had gone on to legendary careers, others had faded into obscurity, but all of them had known David Chen as a master of his craft, a man who'd revolutionized action cinema in Hong Kong before Hollywood came calling with promises of broader audiences and bigger budgets. They'd killed him as surely as if they'd put a gun to his head. The refrigerator hummed in the background, a sound that reminded Wei of the industrial equipment that filled every film set. Generators, air conditioning units, the mechanical heartbeat of an industry built on artifice. He opened it and found leftover dim sum from his favorite restaurant in Chinatown, a place where the servers spoke to him in Cantonese and didn't seem to notice or care that he was the man behind some of the biggest action sequences in recent memory. As he heated the food, Wei's mind drifted to the crew members he'd left behind tonight. Maria Santos, his assistant coordinator, who'd followed him from 3 previous productions because she trusted his safety protocols. Tommy Nakamura, a driver who could thread a motorcycle through spaces that shouldn't exist. Sarah Beth Collins, a former Olympic gymnast who'd found new life as a stunt performer under Wei's mentorship. They were good people who'd built their livelihoods around his reputation. Tonight's decision would affect them all, potentially blacklisting them by association when the industry closed ranks to protect itself. The weight of that responsibility settled in his chest like a physical ache, but some things mattered more than careers. Some things mattered more than the comfortable invisibility Wei had cultivated over 3 decades of patience. His father's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with detailed notes about American production methods, safety concerns that had been dismissed, cultural barriers that had frustrated communication on set. David Chen had been meticulous in his documentation, a habit he'd passed on to his son, along with his mastery of action choreography. Wei traced his finger along one particular entry, dated 3 days before the accident. Equipment inspector argues with me about cable specifications. Says I don't understand American standards. I understand plenty. I understand corners being cut. I understand money mattering more than lives. The dim sum sat cooling as Wei continued reading entries he'd memorized years ago. His father's growing concern about production shortcuts, his attempts to communicate safety issues despite the language barrier that had made him seem uncertain when he was anything but. His frustration with a system that treated him as an exotic novelty rather than a professional with 40 years of experience. The final entry, written the morning of the accident, consisted of just 4 words in his father's careful English. Today feels very wrong. Wei closed the journal and checked his phone. 57 missed calls now. The entertainment websites would have the story within hours. By morning, the footage from his hidden recording devices would begin surfacing, along with documents that would raise questions the industry had spent 30 years trying to bury. Outside, Atlanta slept peacefully, unaware that one quiet man's decision had just set in motion the biggest scandal in Hollywood history. Wei's phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Not the relentless studio executives or panicked producers who'd been calling all night. This was different. The caller ID showed only numbers, an international prefix he recognized immediately: Hong Kong. His hand hesitated over the phone. In 30 years of methodical planning, Wei had anticipated every possible response to tonight's actions: studio threats, legal maneuvers, industry blacklisting. But he hadn't expected this. The voice that greeted him spoke in rapid Cantonese, aged but unmistakable. "Wei Ming, it's time we talked." Uncle Lau. His father's former business partner, the man who'd built Golden Dragon Productions into Hong Kong's most respected action film company. The man who'd warned David Chen not to trust the American studios, who'd begged him not to take the Pacific Thunder job. "I've been watching the news feeds from Atlanta," Lau continued, his voice carrying across the ocean with startling clarity. 30 years I've waited for this phone call." Wei's throat felt dry. He'd severed all connections to his father's Hong Kong colleagues after the accident, believing isolation was protection. "Uncle Lau, how did I know?" "Boy, you think Hollywood keeps secrets from the rest of the world?" Lau's laugh held no humor. "I've been tracking your career since you disappeared into their machine. Every film credit, every stunt sequence, waiting for you to remember who you really are." Through his kitchen window, Wei could see the first hints of dawn touching the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, studio executives were probably still in crisis meetings, calculating damage control strategies. They had no idea the real storm was just beginning. "I have something that belongs to you," Lau said. "Something your father left behind. Something that changes everything you think you know about that day." Wei's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "The real footage, Wei Ming. The angles the studio never released. Your father wasn't just documenting safety concerns, he was gathering evidence, just like his son, it seems." The words hit Wei like a physical blow. For 30 years, he'd based his quest for justice on his father's journal entries, witness testimonies, and official reports. But footage from the actual accident? The studio had claimed all cameras malfunctioned simultaneously, a convenient technical failure that had helped bury the investigation. That's impossible. The equipment failed on their cameras, yes, but your father was old school, suspicious of people who promised him American dreams. He brought his own camera operator, my nephew Chen Ming. Hidden angles, backup recordings. We've had the truth sitting in a Hong Kong vault for 3 decades, waiting for the right moment. Wei's legs gave out, and he found himself sitting heavily on his kitchen chair. His father's journal lay open before him, those final prophetic words seeming to glow in the dim light. Today feels very wrong. Why now? Wei's voice barely rose above a whisper. Because before tonight you were just another cog in their machine. Now you're a threat. Now they'll come at you with everything. Lawyers, fixers, people who make problems disappear permanently. You'll need proof that can't be buried or discredited. You'll need the truth. Outside, Wei could hear the first sounds of morning traffic, the city waking up to a day that would reshape everything. In a few hours, his planted recordings would start surfacing online. By evening, the industry would be in full crisis mode. By week's end, congressional investigations would be announced. But this changed everything. This made it personal in ways that went beyond justice, beyond revenge. This was about honor, about finishing something his father had started. There's more, Lau continued. Names, documents, financial records showing who gave the orders to cut corners that day. The equipment inspector who argued with your father, he wasn't just some random safety officer. He was Marcus Kellerman's uncle, brought in specifically to override your father's concerns. The room seemed to tilt around Wei Kellerman, the same director who'd humiliated him tonight, who'd mocked his accent and dismissed his methods as outdated. The connection wasn't coincidence. It was completion of a circle that had been 30 years in the making. They'd been watching you too, Wei Ming, keeping you close, giving you prestigious projects, making sure you never dug too deep. Tonight, you broke that arrangement. Tonight, you became the thing they feared most. David Chen's son fully awakened. Wei closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his father's journal, the phantom presence of 30 years' worth of buried evidence, the magnitude of what lay ahead. When he opened them again, he was no longer the silent stunt coordinator who'd walked off a Hollywood set in quiet protest. He was his father's son, armed with the truth, and there was no going back. Send everything, he said in Cantonese. It's time to finish this. The line went dead, leaving Wei staring at his phone in the gray Atlanta dawn. His hands, steady through thousands of death-defying stunts, trembled as he set the device on the kitchen table beside his father's journal. 30 years of careful planning, and now everything was accelerating beyond his control. He tried to return to his normal morning routine, coffee first, then review of the day's safety protocols. But there would be no protocols today, no crew to protect. The illusion of normalcy crumbled as his phone resumed its relentless buzzing. Different numbers now, reporters who'd somehow gotten his personal line. Wei ignored them all and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the residue of last night's confrontation. But Kellerman's voice echoed in the steam. Maybe try speaking English next time. The same dismissive tone, the same casual cruelty that had silenced his father 3 decades ago. By 7 a.m., his quiet neighborhood had transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Wei watched through his bedroom curtains as reporters positioned themselves on his lawn, rehearsing their opening lines. His phone rang again. This time, a number he recognized. Maria Santos, his assistant coordinator. Wei, what the hell is happening? Maria's voice carried exhaustion and confusion. I've got studio security at my hotel asking questions about you. They want to know about your files, your equipment, what you might have taken from set. Wei's stomach clenched. They were moving faster than expected, pressure testing his inner circle for weak points. What did you tell them? Nothing, because I don't know anything. But they're scared, Wei, really scared. I've never seen executives move like this. Maria paused, and Wei could hear traffic in the background. Tommy and Sarah are getting the same treatment. We're all being relocated to different hotels for our safety. What kind of safety requires armed guards in the lobby? The systematic isolation had begun. His crew, people who'd trusted him with their careers and their lives, were being swept up in the industry's damage control machine. Wei closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility he'd carried since walking off that soundstage. Maria, listen to me carefully. Whatever they offer you, whatever they threaten, remember that everything I've done has been about protecting people like us. Sometimes protection requires sacrifice. Wei. But the line was already dead. probably cut by someone with more power than a stunt coordinator's assistant. Wei's laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender's address was a string of random characters, but the attachment made his breath catch. A video file labeled Pacific Thunder Angle 71989.mov. Uncle Lau had wasted no time. His finger hovered over the file. Once opened, there would be no pretending anymore. No comfortable distance from the truth he'd spent 30 years pursuing in abstract terms of justice and accountability. This would make it real. His father's final moments, captured from an angle the studio had claimed didn't exist. Before he could decide, car doors slammed outside. Through the curtains, Wei watched two black SUVs disgorge men in expensive suits. Not reporters. Their movements were too purposeful, too coordinated. Studio security or something worse. They didn't knock. The front door simply opened, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver hair and predatory eyes. Wei recognized her from industry magazines. Catherine Morse, Apex Entertainment's head of crisis management. The fixer who'd made scandals disappear for 2 decades. "Mr. Chen," she said, stepping into his kitchen without invitation. "We need to talk." Her companions positioned themselves by the exits with military precision. Wei noticed the bulges under their jackets, the way they scanned the room's corners. These weren't just security guards. "Nice photos," Morse continued, examining his father's pictures on the counter. David Chen was a legend. Tragic what happened to him. Accidents on set. They're everyone's nightmare. Wei said nothing, watching her fingers trace his father's memorial photograph. "Here's what's going to happen," Morse continued conversationally. "You're going to return to set this morning with a story about food poisoning, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Your crew is already being briefed on the approved narrative." She gestured to one of her men, who produced a tablet showing live security footage from the hotel where Maria was staying. His assistant coordinator sat at a conference table surrounded by men in suits, her face pale with fear. "Accidents happen so easily in this business," Morse said softly. "Stunt sequences go wrong, equipment fails, people get hurt when safety protocols aren't properly followed." Her smile never wavered. "We'd hate to see that happen to your friends." Wei's phone sat on the table between them, the unopened video file waiting like a loaded gun. Morse followed his gaze and nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. Your father learned that lesson too late." The threat hung in the air like smoke. 30 years of careful planning, reduced to a choice between justice and the lives of innocents who'd trusted him. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Atlanta, and Wei Chen realized his war with Hollywood had truly begun. Wei's fingers moved toward the laptop without conscious thought, driven by 30 years of suppressed need. The video file opened with a soft chime that seemed to echo through his small kitchen like a gunshot. The footage began with familiar chaos, the controlled pandemonium of a major Hollywood production in 1989. Wei recognized the Pacific Thunder set immediately, though he'd been only 23 then, working as a junior stunt performer under his father's watchful eye. The camera angle was high and wide, positioned where no official cameras should have been. His father appeared on screen, moving with the fluid precision that had made him legendary. David Chen, at 55, directing a complex wire sequence while American crew members watched with barely concealed impatience. Even through the grainy footage, Wei could see the tension in his father's shoulders, the way he checked and double-checked every connection. "No," Wei whispered, but the video continued. The equipment inspector entered the frame, a younger man with Kellerman's distinctive jaw and aggressive posture. Marcus Kellerman's uncle, just as Lau had said. The confrontation was silent from this distance, but their body language told the story clearly. The inspector pointing dismissively at David's careful preparations. His father's increasingly animated gestures as he tried to explain the safety concerns. Other crew members gathering to watch, their faces showing embarrassment rather than support. Wei's hands clenched as his father was physically pushed aside, his safety rigging dismissed with a wave. In the background, he could see his younger self starting to move forward, then stopping as his father caught his eye and shook his head firmly. "Stay back. Don't make this worse." The same silence his father had chosen, the same silence Wei had carried for 30 years. The accident happened exactly as the official reports described. Cable failure during a 20-foot fall sequence, the safety harness that should have arrested the stunt performer's descent simply snapping under load. But this angle revealed what the studio footage had carefully omitted: David Chen throwing himself forward in a desperate attempt to break the falling man's impact, taking the full force of both bodies as they crashed into the concrete set floor. The official story had called it an equipment malfunction. David's death, an unfortunate byproduct of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This footage showed the truth: a father figure sacrificing himself to save a young stunt performer whose safety equipment had been compromised by corporate cost-cutting and ethnic prejudice. Wei's vision blurred as he watched his father's final moments. The way David had looked directly at the hidden camera before attempting his rescue, as if he knew this evidence would someday matter. The careful hand signal he'd given to his camera operator, Uncle Lau's nephew, ensuring the recording continued even as chaos erupted around them. His father had died knowing the truth would survive him. The video ended with American executives rushing to confiscate equipment, their movements sharp with panic. But they'd missed this angle, dismissed the Hong Kong crew members as too devastated to be thinking clearly. They'd underestimated grief that came wrapped in professional determination. Wei sat in his kitchen, watching the media circus outside his windows, feeling the weight of revelation settling in his bones. His father hadn't just documented safety concerns. He'd known he was walking into a trap, had prepared for betrayal, had trusted his son to eventually complete what he'd started. The 30-year gap between the accident and tonight's confrontation suddenly made sense. It hadn't been about finding the right moment for justice. It had been about Wei becoming worthy of his father's sacrifice, developing the skills and reputation necessary to make the truth matter when it finally emerged. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: equipment failure. Just like 1989, accidents repeat themselves. Choose wisely. The threat was clear, but so was Wei's path forward. His crew was already compromised, their safety contingent on his silence. But his father's footage changed the equation entirely. This wasn't just about exposing one director's racism or even one studio's cover-up practices. This was about systematic suppression of evidence, about an industry willing to murder witnesses to protect its image. Outside, Catherine Morse emerged from one of the SUVs, her phone pressed to her ear. Wei watched her gesturing to the media crowd, her expression calculating rather than concerned. She was orchestrating something larger than a simple intimidation campaign. His laptop chimed again, another file from Hong Kong. Financial records this time, showing payments flowing from Apex Entertainment to equipment inspectors, safety officials, even coroners. A money trail documenting 30 years of systematic corruption that began with his father's death and continued to this morning. The scope of it staggered him. David Chen hadn't been killed by casual prejudice or routine cost-cutting. He'd been eliminated because he'd discovered something that threatened the entire industry's power structure, something worth killing for then, worth killing for now. Wei closed the laptop and stood, his reflection catching in the dark screen. His father's son, finally awakened to his full inheritance of truth and responsibility. Time to honor that legacy, whatever the cost. Wei opened his laptop again, his hands steadier now despite the armed men in his kitchen. Catherine Morse was still examining his father's photographs, her fingers tracing the memorial images with calculated sympathy. She hadn't noticed the video file minimized on his screen, waiting. "You know," Morse said conversationally, "I actually knew your father, briefly. I was just starting at Apex when Pacific Thunder wrapped. Such a dedicated man. Always asking questions, always concerned about safety protocols." Something cold settled in Wei's stomach. Morse would have been in her 20s then, a junior executive, but her tone carried knowledge, intimate details that suggested more than casual acquaintance. "I remember the paperwork from that production," she continued, moving closer to the laptop. "So much paperwork. Equipment manifests, safety reports, witness statements. Amazing how much documentation an accident can generate." Wei's finger hovered over the video file, ready to close it if she looked too closely. But Morse seemed more interested in the photos, picking up the one of David Chen receiving a Hong Kong Film Award. "He was supposed to revolutionize American action sequences," she said. "Bring that Hong Kong magic to Hollywood. Instead," she shrugged, setting the photo down with deliberate carelessness. Sometimes cultural differences just can't be overcome. The casual dismissal hit Wei like a physical blow. This woman had been there. She'd been part of the machinery that buried his father's death, reduced a man's sacrifice to a footnote in production reports. And now she stood in his kitchen, touching his father's memory with the same hands that had filed away the truth. The equipment inspector who overrode your father's safety concerns, Wei said quietly. What was his name? Morse's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind her eyes. Ancient history, Mr. Chen. Personnel records from 30 years ago are hardly relevant to today's situation. Robert Kellerman, Wei said, watching her face. Marcus Kellerman's uncle, hired specifically for that production despite having no prior experience with Hong Kong rigging systems. Now Morse's composure cracked slightly. Her security detail shifted position, suddenly more alert. You've been doing research, she said. Impressive. Though I wonder where you're getting your information. Wei opened the video file again, turning the laptop screen so Morse could see the frozen image of the Pacific Thunder set. Her face went completely white. That's impossible, she whispered. All footage was confiscated by studio security, Wei finished. Yes, I know. I read the reports. Very thorough. Except you missed one camera. The room's atmosphere changed instantly. Morse's guards moved closer, their jackets falling open to reveal shoulder holsters. But Wei felt strangely calm, protected by 30 years of his father's foresight. My father knew, he said, his voice gaining strength. He knew what you were planning, the equipment sabotage, the cost-cutting, the disposal of inconvenient foreign consultants. He documented everything. Morse's phone buzzed frantically, but she ignored it. Her eyes remained fixed on the laptop screen, on the image of David Chen's final day. You want to know why I really walked off that set last night? Wei continued. It wasn't because Marcus Kellerman insulted my accent. It was because I finally recognized the pattern, the same dismissive attitude, the same willingness to sacrifice safety for schedule, the same casual racism that killed my father. He clicked play on the video, and Morse flinched as if struck. The security detail couldn't see the screen from their positions, but their boss's reaction told them everything they needed to know. Marcus doesn't know, does he? Wei said, understanding flooding through him. He thinks his uncle died of natural causes. He has no idea his entire career was built on his family's participation in murder. Morse lunged for the laptop, but Wei was faster, slamming it shut and stepping back. Her mask of professional composure had completely shattered, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. You arrogant little man, she snarled. You think you understand what happened? Your father was supposed to rubber stamp our safety protocols and collect his consulting fee. Instead, he started making demands, threatening to expose trade secrets, holding up million-dollar productions with his perfectionist nonsense. The truth poured out of her like poison from a lanced wound. He brought this on himself with his stubborn pride. Just like you're doing now. Wei stared at her, seeing 30 years of carefully constructed lies crumbling in real time. His father hadn't been killed by accident, or even calculated murder. He'd been eliminated by an industry that viewed foreign expertise as a temporary convenience, easily discarded when it became inconvenient. My father saved that stunt performer's life, Wei said quietly. Your father cost us $40 million in 6 months of delays, Morse shot back. For one expendable stuntman who should have taken direction without question. The casual dismissal of human life, the reduction of his father's sacrifice to an accounting problem, it crystallized everything Wei had spent 3 decades trying to understand. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, and Catherine Morse realized she'd just confessed to conspiracy and murder in front of the wrong man's son. The silence that followed Morse's confession stretched between them like a taut wire. Wei watched her face transform as the magnitude of her admission registered, the shift from fury to calculation to something approaching terror. She'd spent 30 years keeping secrets, and in one moment of rage, she'd undone decades of careful cover-ups. Kill the recording, she said sharply to her men. But Wei wasn't recording. He didn't need to. The video file contained enough evidence to destroy careers, topple executives, rewrite industry history, And Morse's confession had just provided the missing context, the corporate conspiracy that had orchestrated his father's death and buried the truth. "You can't prove anything," Morse said, but her voice carried less conviction now. "Alleged confessions under duress, 30-year-old footage that could be fabricated." "My father kept meticulous records," Wei interrupted. "Equipment serial numbers, modification orders, payment authorizations. Uncle Lau has been preserving everything for 3 decades, waiting for the right moment." He watched understanding dawn in her eyes. This wasn't just about one video or one confession. This was about a systematic documentation project that had been building evidence for 30 years, gathering testimonies from Hong Kong crew members who'd witnessed the cover-up, collecting financial records that showed payment trails leading back to Apex Entertainment. "How many others?" Wei asked quietly. "How many other accidents over the years? How many other foreign consultants who asked too many questions?" Morse's phone continued buzzing insistently. Through the kitchen window, Wei could see more vehicles arriving. News vans, studio cars, unmarked sedans that suggested federal interest. Word was spreading beyond entertainment industry circles. "You have no idea what you're destroying," Morse said, desperation creeping into her voice. "The jobs, the careers, the families dependent on this industry. Your little revenge fantasy could bring down entire studios." "Good," Wei said simply. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Morse stared at him, perhaps recognizing for the first time that she wasn't dealing with a grieving son seeking closure. This was a man who'd spent 3 decades building toward this moment, who'd sacrificed his own voice and dignity to position himself perfectly for systematic destruction of everything that had killed his father. "Your crew," Morse said, grasping for leverage. "Maria, Tommy, Sarah, they're in protective custody right now. Accidents can be arranged so easily. Equipment failures, vehicle malfunctions." "Touch them," Wei said, his voice carrying deadly quiet, "and I'll release everything. Not just the video evidence, not just the financial records, the federal witness protection files, the congressional testimony transcripts, the international tribunal documentation." Morse's face went gray. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this level of preparation. Wei had anticipated her threats, had built safeguards into his revelation strategy that made retaliation impossible without triggering even more devastating exposure. "Witness protection," she whispered. "Did you think Uncle Lau stayed in Hong Kong all these years out of loyalty? He's been testifying to federal investigators since 1995, building a RICO case that encompasses fraud, conspiracy, and yes, murder. My father's death was just the beginning." Wei moved to the window, watching the media circus intensify outside. Soon, the truth would be beyond anyone's ability to contain. But first, there was something else that needed resolution. "Marcus Kellerman," Wei said. "He's going to learn about his uncle today, about his family's role in my father's death, about how his entire career was built on blood money and covered-up evidence." "Marcus is innocent in this," Morse protested. "He was a child when—" "He perpetuated it," Wei cut her off. "Every racist comment, every dismissal of foreign expertise, every time he treated people like me as expendable. He may not have known the full truth, but he embraced the culture that made murder profitable." Morse's phone finally stopped buzzing. In the sudden quiet, they could hear helicopters overhead, news crews getting aerial footage of the developing story. The containment phase was over. Now came consequences. "There's still time," Morse said desperately. "We could arrange something. Compensation for your family, guarantees about future industry practices, reforms that would prevent—" "My father is beyond compensation," Wei said, "and reform implies the system is salvageable. Some things are too corrupt to fix. They have to be torn down completely." He opened his laptop again, his fingers moving across the keyboard with calm precision, uploading files to servers around the world, triggering releases to journalists in 12 countries, activating testimony from witnesses who'd been silent for decades. "This is about more than justice for my father," Wei said as progress bars filled his screen. "This is about every stunt performer who died from preventable accidents, every foreign consultant who was silenced, every family that was told their loved one's death was just the cost of doing business in Hollywood." Outside, Catherine Morse's carefully constructed world began its final collapse. And inside his father's kitchen, Wei Chen finally spoke with his true voice. The upload completed with a soft chime that seemed to echo through the kitchen like a funeral bell. Wei closed the laptop and turned to face Catherine Morse, whose perfectly composed executive mask had finally cracked beyond repair. In the morning light streaming through his father's windows, she looked older, smaller, a woman who'd built her empire on buried secrets, now watching it crumble in real time. "It's done," Wei said quietly. 30 years of evidence, now in the hands of journalists, federal prosecutors, and international film commissions. By tonight, the world will know exactly how David Chen died and why. Morse's security detail shifted nervously, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. But what could they do now? The truth was already spreading across digital networks, beyond the reach of intimidation or violence. Their power had always depended on controlling information, and that control had just evaporated. "You've destroyed everything," Morse whispered, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Decades of progress, thousands of careers, built on lies," Wei interrupted. "Built on my father's grave." His phone rang. Marcus Kellerman's name flashed on the screen. Wei answered, putting it on speaker so Morse could hear the director's panicked breathing. "Chen, what the hell is happening?" "The studio's in chaos. Reporters are calling about my uncle, and Morse isn't answering her phone. People are saying there's video evidence from Pacific Thunder." "There is," Wei said simply. "Your uncle took money to approve faulty equipment. My father died trying to save a stunt performer whose safety gear had been sabotaged to cut costs. And your family has profited from that cover-up for 3 decades. The silence on the line stretched until Wei wondered if the call had dropped. When Kellerman spoke again, his voice was barely recognizable. That's impossible. Uncle Robert was a safety inspector. He saved lives." "He ended them," Wei said, watching Morse's face contort with rage and desperation. "Including my father's. The evidence is already public, Marcus. By tomorrow, every news outlet in the world will know what your uncle did, what the studio covered up, and what you've perpetuated." "I didn't know," Kellerman whispered. "Jesus Christ, I didn't know." "But you participated," Wei said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Every time you mocked a foreign accent, every time you dismissed non-American expertise, every time you treated people like me as expendable, you honored your uncle's legacy. You kept his work alive. The line went dead." Through the kitchen window, Wei could see more vehicles arriving. Federal cars with government plates, news vans with satellite dishes, studio executives in expensive suits, looking like pallbearers at their own funeral. Morse made a desperate lunge for the laptop, but Wei stepped aside with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent 30 years perfecting his craft. Her security moved forward, but stopped as Wei raised his phone. "One text message," he said calmly, "and the witness protection documentation goes public immediately. Every name, every testimony, every piece of evidence that's been building for 30 years. How many federal agents do you think are watching this house right now?" As if summoned by his words, unmarked sedans pulled up outside. Men in dark suits emerged, their movements coordinated and professional. The FBI had been waiting for this moment as long as Wei had, building their own case while he gathered the evidence they needed. "Catherine Morse," came a voice from the front door, accompanied by the sound of boots on hardwood. "FBI, we have warrants." Morse closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with the weight of inevitability. When she opened them again, she looked at Wei with something that might have been respect. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly. "My father was proud of me from the day he died," Wei replied. "He knew I would finish what he started. He trusted me to honor his sacrifice." The FBI agents entered the kitchen, their leader, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, surveying the scene with professional calm. She nodded to Wei as if they were old acquaintances, which, in a sense, they were. Agent Patricia Hawkins had been building this case since 1995, when Uncle Lau first approached federal investigators with fragments of evidence and whispered testimony. "Mr. Chen," she said formally, "thank you for your cooperation over the years." Morse stared between them, understanding finally dawning. "You've been working with them all along." "My father believed in justice," Wei said as handcuffs clicked around Morse's wrists. He taught me that truth has its own timeline, its own patience. 30 years wasn't too long to wait. As they led Morse away, she looked back one final time. This won't bring him back, she said. No, Wei agreed, watching his father's memorial photographs catch the morning light. But it honors him, and it ensures no other father dies the way he did. Outside, the helicopters circled like mechanical vultures, broadcasting the end of an era to the world below. The house fell silent after the agents left, a profound quiet that Wei hadn't experienced in 30 years. He stood in his father's kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of revelation, scattered photographs, an open laptop, the lingering scent of Catherine Morse's expensive perfume mixing with the jasmine tea he'd never finished drinking. Through the windows, the media circus continued its frenzied dance, but inside, time seemed suspended. Wei picked up his father's photograph from the counter, the one Morse had handled so carelessly. David Chen's face gazed back at him, serious, determined, wearing the expression Wei remembered from their last conversation about integrity and patience. The glass was cracked where it had been set down too hard, a hairline fracture running across his father's forehead like a scar. It's finished, Ba, Wei thought, using the childhood name he'd never spoken aloud since 1989. They know the truth now. His phone buzzed constantly. Journalists, studio executives, old colleagues from the Hong Kong film community who'd seen the news breaking across international networks. But Wei ignored them all. Moving through his father's house like a ghost finally granted permission to rest. In the living room, he found Uncle Lau sitting quietly on the couch, having arrived while Wei was dealing with the FBI. The old man looked impossibly frail, as if releasing 30 years of secrets had drained something essential from his body. His hands shook as he held a cup of tea Wei didn't remember making. "I called your father's spirit last night," Uncle Lau said without preamble. Told him his son had become the man he hoped for, a man who finishes what he starts. Wei sat beside him, feeling the weight of completed duty settling into his bones. "What happens now?" "Now you learn to live without carrying the dead," Uncle Lau replied. "The hardest thing for a good son." Outside, a news helicopter circled lower, its cameras capturing the unremarkable suburban house where an empire had crumbled. Wei watched it with detached interest, remembering the boy who'd once dreamed of following his father into the movies. That boy had died the same day David Chen did, replaced by a man with a single, consuming purpose. Maria called. Uncle Lau continued. "Your crew is safe. Tommy wants to know if you're planning to work again. Sarah has 3 studios offering her department head positions." He paused, studying Wei's face. "They're worried about you." Wei almost smiled. His stunt family, loyal to the end, more concerned about his well-being than their own careers in an industry that would soon be unrecognizable. "Tell them I'm proud of them, and that they should take those offers. Hollywood will need good people to rebuild properly. And you?" The question hung between them like incense smoke. Wei looked around his father's house, the shrine corner with its offerings, the walls lined with photographs from a life cut short, the accumulated weight of memory and grief. For 30 years, this place had been both sanctuary and prison, a repository for everything he couldn't let go. "I think," Wei said slowly, "I'd like to see Hong Kong again. Really see it. Not just as David Chen's son or the man with a mission. Just as Wei." Uncle Lau nodded, as if this was the answer he'd been expecting. "Your father has a grave there, you know. A proper one, not just the memorial here. I could show you where the jasmine grows wild on the hillside." Through the kitchen doorway, Wei could see the laptop still open on the counter, its screen dark now that its purpose was fulfilled. Somewhere in cyberspace, the evidence continued spreading. Financial records, witness testimonies, video footage that would rewrite film history textbooks. Congressional hearings would follow, industry reforms, criminal trials that might last for years. But Wei found he had no desire to watch the aftermath unfold. He'd spent 3 decades building toward one moment of revelation, and now that moment had passed, leaving him feeling strangely hollow, not empty, cleansed, like a temple after the incense has burned away. His phone rang one final time. Marcus Kellerman's name appeared again, But Wei declined the call without listening to the voicemail. Whatever the director wanted to say, apology, explanation, justification, it belonged to the old world, the one where Wei Chen had been silent and his father's death had been a forgotten footnote. That world was ending. In boardrooms across Los Angeles, executives were destroying documents and calling lawyers. Insurance companies were calculating payouts for decades of covered-up negligence. Foreign filmmakers were finally feeling safe to share their own stories of discrimination and abuse. And in a quiet house in the San Fernando Valley, a son finally set down a burden he'd carried since childhood, while his father's spirit, patient, proud, and peaceful at last, ascended into memory where it belonged. The helicopters circled one more time, then moved on to other breaking stories. Inside, two old men finished their tea in comfortable silence, planning a journey home.